What happens when the very fabric of a city is torn apart in an instant, leaving behind only devastation and despair? On August 9, 1945, the atomic bomb called Fat Man detonated above Nagasaki, unleashing a force unlike anything the world had ever seen. In a blinding flash, valleys became furnaces, neighborhoods vanished, and tens of thousands of lives were erased in moments. But Nagasaki's story is not just about destruction. It is about decisions made in distant rooms, by leaders divided between surrender and resistance, by generals racing against time, weather, and history. Why did the United States strike again so soon after Hiroshima? What calculations, what fears, what ambitions drove the second atomic bomb from blueprint to battlefield? This is the story of a city chosen by fate, of ordinary families caught in extraordinary fire, and of the haunting questions of power and morality that still echo across our world today.
August 1945. The world is suspended between destruction and surrender. Hiroshima lies in ruins, its streets reduced to ash, its people silenced in a single flash of light. And yet, even as smoke still rose from the ruins, another city lived its final days in ignorance. Nagasaki. A port city tucked between mountains and the sea, known for its shipyards, its merchants, its churches, and its narrow valleys. For centuries, it was Japan's gateway to the outside world, where Dutch traders brought foreign goods, where missionaries once spread forbidden faith. A city that had endured fires, persecutions, and even an atomic shadow of history long before it was chosen by fate. On the morning of August 7th, as Hiroshima's survivors stumbled through horror, Nagasaki's fishermen rowed out into the bay. Children walked to school. Factories hammered out weapons for a war already lost. The citizens did not yet know that their name would soon be burned into history forever. But far above them, in the corridors of Washington and Tokyo, the forces that would seal their fate were already in motion. In Tokyo, 6 men known as the Big Six debated in secret rooms. Half believed the war must continue, no matter the cost. Half begged for peace before Japan was utterly destroyed. And above them all, silent, was the emperor, watching, weighing, waiting. In Washington, President Harry Truman had returned from the Potsdam Conference. He knew the Soviets would soon enter the war. He knew an invasion of Japan might kill over 1 million soldiers and civilians. And he knew that a second bomb, already prepared, already waiting, was more than just a weapon. It was a message to the world. The Manhattan Project had become unstoppable. Years of secrecy, billions of dollars, an army of scientists, all converging to prove not just one bomb, but many. Hiroshima had been the first demonstration. But inside America's war councils, the question whispered. Would one explosion be enough to shock Japan into surrender? Or must there be another? And so the calendar page turned, August 8th, August 9th. Each sunrise narrowing the distance between ordinary life in Nagasaki and the firestorm that awaited. The city itself was not even the original target. Kakura, an industrial hub to the north, had been chosen. But fate is never written cleanly. Weather, clouds, and smoke would guide the hands of history. And Nagasaki, hidden behind hills, narrow, unassuming, would inherit the burden of mankind's second son. The stage was set. A world exhausted by war, leaders divided by fear and ambition, and a city unaware that destiny had already called its name. Nagasaki would become not only a place of death, but a question etched into eternity. was the second bomb necessary, or was it inevitable? Summer, 1945. Europe is quiet for the first time in 6 years. Germany has fallen. The flags are folded, the camps laid bare, and the guns in the West have finally run out of targets. But in the Pacific, the storm has not passed. It has gathered, tightened, and turned toward the last fortress of a dying empire, Japan, alone. Across the islands and seas, the war has carved a path of attrition and fire. Iwo Jima, secured at a cost that still haunts the living. Okinawa, an inferno where soldiers and civilians were pulled under by the same tide. Fleets that once roamed in pride now sink in silence. Cities of wood and paper have met gasoline and flame. The night sky above Tokyo has glowed like a furnace, and the morning has risen over streets of ash. On both sides, the ledger is written in blood and exhaustion. In the United States, the telegrams have been pinned to kitchen walls, gold stars have replaced blue. Factories that never slept now pound toward an endgame measured in ships, bullets, and bodies. The planners' maps are blunt. To invade the home islands would demand a price measured in hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps 1 million when the wounded and missing are counted. Mothers pray for sons who are already on transports. Generals calculate beaches and tides and the arithmetic of sacrifice. The nation wants the war to end, but it must end in a way that will not begin another. Japan, too, is a nation held together by thread and will. The seas are choked by blockade. Fuel is scarce. Rice bowls are thin. The air raid sirens arrive like weather. And yet in rooms of lacquer and shadow, 6 men gather around a table and try to decide the fate of millions. They are the Supreme War Council, the Big Six. On one side, the hardliners, men of the army and navy who believe that the spirit of the nation, sharpened in the crucible of a last battle, can still force a negotiated peace. They imagine beaches turned to traps, skies seeded with suicide pilots, schoolboys trained to stab at the belly of fate. On the other side, the peace-seekers, men who see the map for what it is and the horizon for what it brings. They know the Allies are coming not just with ships, but with inevitability. Between them stands a silence that carries the weight of 1,000 years, the Emperor. He listens. He waits. He measures not just victory and defeat, but the survival of a people, a throne, a civilization. Beyond Tokyo, the world's leaders have gathered in the ruins of Europe to chart a new order. At Potsdam, the Allied message to Japan is simple and terrible: surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction. This is a line drawn not in ink, but in the edge of history. In Tokyo, the words are examined like a wounded bird, turned in the hand, studied for life. Some propose ignoring them, to withhold comment and keep face, hoping the Allies will blink. Others hear in the tone something final, a warning that the old ways of war have reached their limit. America's war planners do not wait for hope. They draw 2 lines across the future and name them invasions. One line is Operation Olympic, aimed at Kyushu, the southern gateway to the home islands. The other is Operation Coronet, a thrust toward the Kanto Plain and Tokyo itself. They estimate the beaches, count the machine guns, and imagine a defense too grim to speak aloud. Purple Hearts are minted by the hundreds of thousands in preparation for what may come. The machine of war, once set in motion, runs on momentum and fear. Yet even as the Army and Navy sketched the last great amphibious gambit, another current has gathered in secret. It began years earlier in guarded laboratories and fenced deserts, where men and women chased a theory toward a weapon. It was called the Manhattan Project. Its budget was hidden. Its cities were invisible. Its work was a race against both an enemy and an idea, that the sun could be summoned to a battlefield. The first proof came in the desert of New Mexico. A new light at dawn that outshone the sunrise. A test with a name out of scripture, and a result that seemed to crack the horizon of possibility. In that instant, war crossed a threshold. The plan ceased to be hypothetical. The bomb was no longer an experiment, it was an instrument, assembled in pieces, shipped across oceans, and positioned for use at the world's edge. The Pacific island of Tinian turned into a runway for destiny. There, under camouflage and code, bomb casings were married to plutonium cores. Crews trained for missions whose targets were printed on slips of paper and kept in locked drawers. Strategic no longer meant fleets or factories. It meant cities, names on maps that would soon be more memory than place. And yet, for all the steel and science, the war remained a human argument. In Washington, the president weighed the powers of his office against the gravity of what his signature would propel. Advisors brought him mathematics and forecasts, casualty curves and diplomatic calculus. End the war quickly. Save American lives. Deter the Soviets. Demonstrate the limits of resistance. Each reason sounded like a verdict. Together, they sounded like history snapping shut. In Tokyo, the same mathematics looked different. Pride and fear, duty and exhaustion, all mingled in the minds of men who had never imagined surrender. The army believed that if the invaders were forced to pay enough to take the beaches, they would offer better terms. The Navy, beaten at sea, could no longer promise to hold back the tide. The Foreign Ministry stared into a narrowing window, one last chance to use diplomacy to preserve the emperor's place and the nation's soul. And in the background, an unspoken certainty, the Soviet Union had not yet joined the fight against Japan, but the neutrality between them was a thread about to break. The clock ticked on, August within reach. American B-29s ranged farther and struck harder. Japanese radar stations counted them, then lost them in clouds. Civilians dug trenches they would never use. Families wrapped heirlooms and buried them under garden stones. The Imperial Cabinet met and adjourned, like a ship turning in circles while the storm approached. At Potsdam, after the warning, the leaders went home with their conclusions. The United States had built a weapon that could end the war in days or ignite debates that might never end. Japan had received a message that admitted no reply but surrender. The distance between those two truths was filled with all the illusions, ideologies, and hopes that had launched this war in the first place. By early August, the world sat on a hinge. On one side lay invasion, armies that would collide on beaches and plains, a war extended into months of blood. On the other side lay something new. A promise that one sky could be turned into daylight, that an entire city could be undone in a single breath, and that the shock would be so complete the war would end at once. The choice, in truth, was not between mercy and cruelty. It was between kinds of catastrophe. The Allied command believed that overwhelming shock might save more lives than a grinding invasion. The Japanese High Command believed that a nation's honor could be defended by accepting annihilation rather than capitulation. Between these beliefs stood simple realities, empty granaries, wrecked railways, burnt neighborhoods, and a people who had already given everything they had to give. And so the stage set itself. The Big Six continued their deadlocked ritual. The emperor listened from a distance where tradition required him to dwell. In Washington, the schedules tightened, the weather forecasts were updated, and the bombs were readied, not just built, but queued. The machine had a timetable. The war had a rhythm. The skies had a window. The world on the brink is a world where every sunrise feels like a verdict. Where the past cannot be undone and the future is a cliff. In those days, the distance between a map in a cabinet room and a family in a wooden house was only the time it took a bomber to cross a sea. Soon, the warning at Potsdam would become more than words. Soon, the argument inside Tokyo would be interrupted by a new kind of fire. And soon, humanity would learn that the end of one war could also be the beginning of a shadow that would stretch across generations. This is where we stand, on the edge of a decision whose echoes have not yet faded. Europe has ended its war. Japan has not. The Allies have drawn their line. The bomb waits in silence. And the world, exhausted and afraid, leans toward whatever will bring the night to a close, without yet understanding the dawn it will bring. August 6, 1945. Dawn broke over the city of Hiroshima like any other summer morning. Children prepared for school, workers hurried toward the factories, soldiers gathered in barracks. The river flowed quietly beneath its bridges, its waters reflecting tiled rooftops and narrow streets. To those who lived there, it was simply another day in a war that had already devoured years. But far above the Pacific, a single aircraft cut across the sky, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay. Inside, a weapon unlike any other carried a name almost deceptively simple, Little Boy. It was the culmination of years of secret labor, science drawn from theory into steel and uranium, all for this moment. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay opened. The weapon fell for 43 seconds. In that span, Hiroshima still lived. Markets bustled. Tram lines rattled. A child raised a hand to shade her eyes. Then the world became light. A blinding flash brighter than 1,000 suns ripped across the city. In a single instant, glass turned to liquid, steel bent like paper, and human shadows etched themselves permanently onto walls and stone. A fireball swallowed Hiroshima whole. Within seconds, tens of thousands were gone, vaporized where they stood, their existence reduced to outlines scorched onto the surfaces behind them. Those who survived the first blast faced a nightmare beyond comprehension. Houses collapsed into flame. Rivers filled with bodies of the burned and the drowning. The sky turned black as smoke and ash twisted into a towering mushroom cloud. Survivors staggered through the ruins, their skin hanging in strips, their voices reduced to cries of water, only water. Hiroshima, in that moment, became the first atomic city. A place where life and death were divided not by distance, but by shadows, by the angle of a wall, by whether one had been inside or outside. News traveled slowly. The Japanese military at first refused to believe it could be an atomic weapon. Perhaps, they thought, it was a new kind of incendiary raid, or a massive stockpile of explosives. The scale was beyond comprehension. Even as survivors fled the ruins, Tokyo's War Council debated in disbelief. Could a single bomb truly erase an entire city? In Washington, leaders waited for a signal, a surrender, an admission, any sign that Hiroshima had broken Japan's will. The scientists of the Manhattan Project knew what they had unleashed, but even they were shaken by the sheer magnitude. President Truman, informed of the success, announced to the world that a new force had entered history, a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. But Japan did not surrender. The Big Six split again into two camps. Hardliners insisted the nation could still fight. They argued Hiroshima was an anomaly, a single terrible strike that America could not repeat. Peace-seekers begged to treat it as a warning, to preserve what remained before annihilation became inevitable. And through it all, the emperor said nothing, his silence weighing heavier than words. For 3 days, the world waited. America believed Hiroshima should have been enough to shock Tokyo into capitulation. But the silence that followed, the refusal to yield, set the stage for what would come next. And so, as Hiroshima smoldered, as families dug through rubble searching for names that no longer had faces, another bomb was prepared. A second plane was loaded. Another city was unknowingly chosen. The dawn that brought fire to Hiroshima was not the end. It was the beginning of a new age, and a prelude to a second sun that would rise, this time over Nagasaki. August 8, 1945. While Hiroshima still smoldered, while its survivors staggered through ruins searching for water and for loved ones, another front of the war erupted with thunder. At midnight, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Hours later, more than 1 million Red Army soldiers poured across the borders of Manchuria. Tanks rolled through dust and shattered rail lines. Artillery thundered against Japanese fortifications that had stood for years. From the Siberian plains to the shores of Korea, Stalin's armies advanced with overwhelming force. The neutrality pact Japan had clung to, its one fragile shield against the Soviet colossus, was gone in an instant. For Tokyo's leaders, the news struck like a second bomb. The Big Six, already paralyzed by Hiroshima, now faced a nightmare with two faces. On one side, the United States wielded a weapon of unimaginable fire. On the other, the Soviet Union, long silent, had bared its teeth and moved with speed no one expected. To the hardliners, the Soviet invasion confirmed their darkest fears: Japan was now encircled. But to the peace-seekers, it shattered the last hope of negotiating an end through Moscow's mediation. Stalin had no intention of saving Japan. He meant to divide it. For Stalin, this was more than war, it was opportunity. At Yalta, he had promised to join the Pacific fight within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Now he made good on his word, but not only to honor his pledge. The prize was far greater: Manchuria's railways, Korea's ports, Sakhaline's oil, and perhaps even a foothold on Japan's northern islands. The Soviet assault was swift, merciless, and calculated. Japanese divisions, already starved of resources, fell back in chaos. Civilians fled burning towns. The Guangdong Army, once one of Japan's proudest formations, was broken in days. And as Stalin's armies advanced, Washington's urgency doubled. The United States had built its bomb not just to end the war, but to shape the world that would follow. If Japan did not surrender quickly, the Soviets would claim their share of the spoils. A divided Asia, like a divided Europe, loomed on the horizon. Time itself became a weapon. Every hour mattered. Every day of delay risked not only more death, but the reshaping of the post-war map. Truman, Stimson, and Groves knew the second bomb was ready. It could fall at any moment. In Tokyo, the council argued still. Some clung to visions of one final decisive battle. Others pleaded to surrender before Japan was carved apart. The emperor listened, distant but attentive, his patience thinning as the empire itself collapsed. Hiroshima had been horror enough. But the silence of Japan's leaders, and the thunder of Soviet cannons, convinced Washington that more was needed, another shock, so devastating it would silence all debate. And so, as Stalin's troops pressed deeper into Asia, another bomber waited on the tarmac, its payload heavy with fate. Its orders were written. Its course was drawn. The world was about to learn that the fire unleashed at Hiroshima had not been singular. For Nagasaki's people, the day of fire crept closer. In the days after Hiroshima, the world seemed to hold its breath. America waited for Japan to surrender. Japan waited for clarity. And the bomb itself waited, its twin, already prepared, already destined for use. Inside the White House, President Harry Truman weighed the silence from Tokyo against the roar of the Soviet offensive. To his advisers, the meaning was clear: Japan had not yet yielded. The war, brutal and consuming, might still drag on. And the Soviets, who had entered the Pacific conflict with crushing speed, were closing in. If the war did not end soon, they would demand their share of Japan's corpse. The United States had invested years, billions of dollars, and the labor of more than 100,000 people in the Manhattan Project. It had created not just one weapon, but an arsenal waiting to be assembled. To use only a single bomb would risk Japan thinking it a fluke, a one-time terror that could not be repeated. But to strike twice, in swift succession, would deliver a message: America possessed not just a new weapon, but the will to use it. In meeting rooms at the Pentagon, General Leslie Groves and the bomb planners spoke bluntly. The second weapon was already on its way to the Pacific. The assembly crews on Tinian worked tirelessly. The weather forecasts were studied with the same urgency as battle maps. If the window closed, the bomb might sit idle for weeks. And momentum, the unstoppable momentum of war, was a thing no general dared to lose. The debate, though, was not without voices of doubt. Some argued Hiroshima should be enough, that the shock already inflicted might yet push Japan to surrender. Scientists wrote letters urging demonstration rather than destruction, detonating the second bomb before international observers, showing its power without annihilation. But those voices were whispers drowned by the urgency of military logic. The commanders insisted, delay risked emboldening Japan's hardliners. Delay risked Soviet gains. Delay risked storms closing skies and planes grounded while soldiers died in foxholes. Every hour of hesitation seemed paid for in blood. And so the order moved forward. The targets had been chosen weeks before. Kakura, an arsenal of war, its factories vital to Japan's defense, was first on the list. Nagasaki, a shipbuilding hub with its narrow valleys and clustered neighborhoods, was second. To the people of those cities, these decisions were invisible, written not in their streets but in corridors half a world away. In Nagasaki, families shopped for food in markets already bare. Workers filed into Mitsubishi's shipyards. Priests in the Urakami Cathedral prepared for morning prayers. None of them knew that fate had placed their city as a backup name on a list. To the planners, it was simple. To the bomb, it was inevitable. By August 8, all pieces were in place. The plutonium core was armed. The B-29, christened Boxcar, stood ready. The mission crews were briefed, their flight plans sketched across maps. Kokura would be the target. If weather closed the city in smoke and cloud, they would turn to Nagasaki. It was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of where. The decision was made not by one man alone, but by the machinery of war itself, politicians driven by fear of Soviet expansion, generals driven by the arithmetic of casualties, and scientists caught in the momentum of a project too vast to stop. The second bomb would fall. Not because Hiroshima had failed, but because Hiroshima had not yet succeeded. And with that, the countdown to Nagasaki began. Dawn broke over the island of Tinian with the humid stillness of the tropics. On the airfield, a silver giant stood waiting, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar. Beneath its belly, cradled by steel and guarded by armed sentries, was a bomb unlike any other. Its code name was Fat Man. Its heart was plutonium. Its destiny was written in fire. At 3:47 a.m., the engines roared to life. The ground crew saluted as Boxcar began its slow roll down the runway, lifting into the dark sky. Inside the cabin, Major Charles Sweeney and his crew sat tense, knowing the weight they carried was not just a weapon, but history itself. The plan was precise. The primary target, Kokura, an arsenal of war, a city of factories and barracks. Nagasaki was only a backup, a name on a list should clouds or smoke obscure the first choice. For the men aboard, the mission was simple. For the people below, fate turned on the weather. By morning, Boxcar approached Kokura. But destiny favors chance, and chance was cruel. Thick clouds blanketed the city. Smoke from a previous air raid drifted across the target. The bombardier strained to find a window. 3 times the bomber circled. 3 times the bomb doors stayed shut. Below, the city lay hidden in haze, spared by a sky that refused to clear. Fuel ran low. The crew faced a choice, abort, or turn to the secondary target. At 11:02 a.m., the decision was made. The plane banked south. Nagasaki, nestled in its narrow Urakami Valley, had become the chosen city. On the ground, life carried on with tragic normalcy. Workers filed into the Mitsubishi shipyards. Children played in schoolyards. Priests in Urakami Cathedral prepared for morning prayer. The city was awake, unaware that in moments, it would be transformed forever. Then, the bomb bay opened. Fat Man fell for 43 seconds. Below, Nagasaki still breathed. The sun shone between clouds. Mothers called their children to lunch. A fisherman cast his net. And then, light. A blinding flash consumed the valley. A fireball erupted, hotter than the surface of the sun. The shockwave tore through wood and stone, shattering houses, toppling factories, crushing bodies in an instant. In Urakami, the cathedral, the largest in East Asia, vanished in a blast that erased centuries of faith in seconds. Within a mile of ground zero, nearly everything alive ceased to exist. Tens of thousands were vaporized. Others staggered from the ruins, their skin burned, their voices breaking into a single cry, Mizu. Water. The rivers ran black with ash and bodies. The hillsides burned. Survivors, blinded and bleeding, stumbled into streets that no longer existed. And yet, fate remained merciless in its randomness. Because of the valley's geography, destruction was uneven. Entire neighborhoods just beyond the ridge were spared, still standing in eerie silence while the Urakami Valley became a cauldron of death. Some families lived because a hill shielded them. Others perished because they lived too near the open plain. By the time the mushroom cloud reached into the sky, Nagasaki had become a city of shadows. 70,000 lives were extinguished in moments. Thousands more would succumb in days and weeks to fire, burns, and the unseen poison of radiation. The crew of Boxcar turned for home, watching the rising cloud from miles away. Behind them, Nagasaki burned. Ahead of them, the war moved one step closer to its end. Chance and weather had sealed a city's fate. Kakura lived. Nagasaki died. And as the smoke climbed into the heavens, the world crossed another threshold. Hiroshima had been horror. Nagasaki was confirmation. Together, they announced the arrival of a power that could erase cities with the pull of a trigger. The second sun had risen. And the age of nuclear fire had begun. August 9, 1945. As Nagasaki smoldered beneath its rising cloud, news of two catastrophes arrived almost together in Tokyo. The second city had been obliterated. The Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria. The empire was being crushed from without and hollowed from within. The Supreme War Council, the Big Six, met once again in the underground chambers of the Imperial Palace. The air was thick with tension, the debate circling like vultures over a dying body. On one side, the hardliners clung to their vision of final battle. They spoke of 100 million dying together, of honor preserved by a nation perishing as one. They imagined schoolgirls with bamboo spears, civilians rushing tanks, kamikaze pilots turning the seas red. They believed that to surrender was worse than death. On the other side, the peace-seekers spoke of Hiroshima, of Nagasaki, of the Soviet thunder rolling through Manchuria. They argued not in poetry, but in cold numbers. The nation had no fuel, no reserves, no shield against a weapon that could erase a city in seconds. They insisted Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration before the country was reduced to ash. And above them all, the emperor. Hirohito had remained a distant figure throughout the war, silent behind tradition and ritual. But now the silence threatened to destroy everything. For the first time in centuries, the voice of the emperor would decide not a ceremony, but the survival of a nation. That night, as the council deadlocked, Hirohito entered the chamber. His words were quiet, but they cut through decades of myth and obedience. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of accepting what the proud samurai spirit could not, surrender. In that moment, Japan's divine sovereign bent before human suffering. Yet even with the emperor's decision, the war did not simply end. Fanatics within the military, unable to accept surrender, moved to seize control. On the night of August 14th, young officers launched a desperate coup. Their aim, to capture the emperor, destroy the surrender recording, and prevent the broadcast that would announce Japan's capitulation. Under cover of darkness, soldiers stormed the palace grounds. Guards were killed. Officials were hunted through corridors. For hours, chaos reigned. The conspirators searched for the phonograph record, the emperor's voice already etched onto it, hidden in a bag by loyal courtiers. If they found it, Japan might plunge into civil war. But fate turned once more. Loyal forces crushed the coup. The plotters failed. The recording was saved. And the next morning, for the first time in history, the people of Japan heard the voice of their emperor. The words were careful, formal, indirect. He never spoke of defeat, only of a new peace. Yet the meaning was clear, the war was over. Some fell to their knees in tears. Others bowed in silence. Many could not even understand the ancient courtly language, but they understood the tone, the voice of a god-king telling them to lay down their arms. Across the empire, the reactions were as fractured as the nation itself. Civilians wept with relief. Soldiers wept with rage. Some committed suicide rather than accept surrender. But the tide had turned. The command was final. The age of fire had ended. The age of ash had begun. For the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the emperor's words came too late to save their homes, their families, their futures. But for millions across Asia and the Pacific, his decision meant life instead of death. And for the world, the moment marked not just the end of the Second World War, but the beginning of a new era, where survival itself would forever be measured against the shadow of nuclear fire. August 15, 1945. The morning sun rose over a broken nation. Across Japan, radios crackled to life. Civilians gathered in silence, on street corners, in burned-out homes, in the rubble of cities already lost. They leaned close, straining to hear words no one in history had ever heard before, the voice of the emperor. The broadcast was brief, formal, distant, delivered in a courtly language few ordinary citizens fully understood. Hirohito never spoke the word surrender. He never admitted defeat. Instead, he spoke of enduring the unendurable and of bringing about a great peace for all generations to come. His voice was calm, almost detached. Yet to a people who had known only silence from their divine ruler, the sound itself was a thunderclap. For millions, the message carried a single, undeniable truth: the war was over. In the streets, men and women wept. Some fell to their knees, overcome by relief that the nightmare of fire and hunger had ended. Mothers clutched their children tightly, whispering prayers of thanks that no invasion would come. Farmers bowed their heads in exhausted gratitude. But not all heard peace in his words. Among soldiers, the reaction was mixed. Many broke down, sobbing over a surrender they could not bear to imagine. Some clutched rifles, unable to let go of their oaths. Others, steeped in the creed of honor unto death, took their own lives rather than obey the command to lay down arms. Even as Japan bowed, a part of it still resisted, caught between pride and survival. For the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the emperor's voice was both salvation and sorrow. The bombs had already stripped them of homes, families, and futures. They listened from hospital wards, from riverbanks, from ruins, their bodies scarred, their lives forever marked. For them, surrender was not an end, but a beginning, one lived among shadows, sickness, and silence. In the Pacific, Allied soldiers received the news with disbelief. Across the seas, ships altered course. Pilots stepped down from cockpits. In America, families poured into the streets, celebrations erupting in waves of joy and relief. The war that had begun in 1941 with fire at Pearl Harbor had ended in 1945 with fire at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet even in victory, a question lingered. What had been won, and what had been lost? The bomb had ended the war, but it had also unveiled a weapon that could end civilization itself. For Japan, August 15th was the day of surrender. But for the world, it was the first day of a new silence, the uneasy quiet of an age forever shadowed by the possibility of annihilation. The guns fell silent. The war was finished. But the echo of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would never fade. The war had ended. But for the survivors of Nagasaki, the battle was only beginning. In the weeks after August 9th, the city was a landscape of shadows and silence. Blackened ruins stretched across the Urakami Valley. Charred timbers marked where homes once stood. The cathedral lay in rubble, its bells buried beneath stone. Survivors, Hibakusha, those exposed to the bomb, stumbled among corpses, searching for water, for medicine, for names on scraps of paper. For many, there was no one left to find. Radiation carried its curse long after the fireball had faded. Burns that seemed to heal split open again. Fevers rose without reason. Hair fell in clumps. Mothers gave birth to infants who did not breathe, or who struggled only briefly before falling silent. Survivors carried not only scars, but shame. In post-war Japan, Hibakusha were often shunned, feared as carriers of sickness, passed over for marriage, denied work. Their suffering was doubled, first by fire, then by silence. Occupation forces entered a broken nation. American troops walked the ruins, their cameras capturing devastation unlike anything seen before. Scientists studied the blast zones, measuring shadows where human beings had stood, studying bones and walls to learn the dimensions of destruction. For the victors, Nagasaki became not only a tragedy but a laboratory, the first case study of a nuclear age. In America, debates erupted. Military leaders claimed the bombs had saved millions of lives, that invasion would have cost more blood than the bombs consumed. Others, including scientists who had built the weapon, called Nagasaki unnecessary, a second strike made inevitable by momentum and politics. Was it strategy? Was it warning? Or was it simply proof of power too great to resist using? The questions began in 1945, and they remain unanswered today. For Nagasaki, the aftermath was measured in decades. The Hibakusha carried their pain forward, giving testimony so the world would not forget. They spoke of skin melted into cloth, of rivers filled with the dying, of children whose shadows lingered on stone long after their bodies were gone. Their words became not only memory, but warning. As Japan rebuilt, as skyscrapers rose and factories hummed, the ruins of Nagasaki were preserved as scars in stone. Peace parks were planted, memorials raised, paper cranes folded by the millions. Every year, bells toll on August 9th, their sound carried across valleys where once a second sun had risen. Globally, Nagasaki marked not just an end, but a beginning. Within months, the Cold War dawned. The United States tested more bombs. The Soviet Union raced to catch up. Soon, Britain, France, and China joined the nuclear club. The sky itself became a frontier for arsenals capable of ending all life. The logic of deterrence was born, Hiroshima and Nagasaki as both threat and reminder, a shadow forcing nations to step carefully in a world where one spark could ignite the end. The legacy of Nagasaki is more than rubble and loss. It is a question humanity still struggles to answer. Was the destruction the price of peace? Or the first act of an age where peace itself is forever hostage to weapons too powerful to use? For those who lived, Nagasaki was never history. It was memory, etched in skin, in silence, in the names of the dead. For the world, it became a mirror. In its ruins, we saw what we were capable of, and what we might one day do again. The shadow of Nagasaki stretches forward still, across generations, across borders, across every debate about power and survival. It reminds us that the end of one war was also the birth of a fear that has never lifted. Two cities. Two suns. Two shadows that have never faded. Hiroshima was the first warning, a flash that revealed what humankind had made of its genius and its fear. Nagasaki was the decision, a second strike that sealed both surrender and destiny. Together, they stand as monuments not only to war's end, but to the dawn of something darker, an age where survival itself is balanced on a trigger. In Hiroshima, a city erased by a single bomb. In Nagasaki, a city chosen by chance, spared one morning by cloud, condemned the next by clear sky. Their names are now carved into history, paired forever, spoken in one breath, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, children lay wreaths beneath peace memorials. Paper cranes drift on the wind. Bells toll at the hour of destruction. The ruins stand not as relics, but as warnings. Beneath them, the shadows of those who once lived still cling to stone, whispering to the living, never again. And yet the questions remain. Was Nagasaki the price of peace, or the opening act of an age forever haunted by the possibility of annihilation? Did the fire that ended one war also begin a countdown that has not yet stopped? Since 1945, no atomic weapon has been used in war. Perhaps it is because of the images of those two cities, burned into human memory. Perhaps it is because the world looked into the abyss and recoiled. Or perhaps it is only because fate has been kind, for now. The shadow of two suns stretches across every capital, every arsenal, every uneasy treaty. It reminds us that power without restraint is destruction without end. Hiroshima was a warning. Nagasaki was a decision. Together, they remain the reason humanity still trembles at its own reflection. The war ended. But the shadow did not. And so the legacy of August 1945 is not only of a world saved, or a war concluded. It is of a choice, made once, remembered always, carried still by every generation that lives beneath the shadow of two suns. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is more than history, it is a warning written in fire. If you believe stories like this must never be forgotten, please take a moment to support this channel. Like this video, share it so others may learn, and tell us in the comments what part of this story struck you most deeply. And if you have not already, subscribe to our channel. Because the next chapter of history may challenge you, haunt you, and inspire you in ways you never expected.